Earth was losing the Galactic War. Then a forgotten human warship returned. The stars over the colony of New Delta used to be beautiful. Now they were full of smoke and dying light. Fleet Admiral Elena Voss stood on the bridge of her flagship, the UES Marigold, and watched 3 more human ships fall silent on her screen. Silent meant dead. She had seen too many ships go silent in the last 2 years. The war had started small. Nobody remembered the first shot anymore. Not really, though the history books liked to pretend they did. What everyone remembered was how fast it grew. One skirmish near a mining outpost turned into a border dispute. A border dispute turned into a fleet battle. A fleet battle turned into a war that swallowed 100 worlds. And the enemy, the Skarn hegemony, had numbers that made human commanders wake up at night in a cold sweat. The Skarn were not cruel for the sake of cruelty. That would have been almost easier to understand. They were cruel because their culture believed weaker species existed to be absorbed, their worlds taken, their people turned into labor or simply erased to make room. Earth was, in the eyes of the hegemony, simply not strong enough to deserve its own space. That was the whole of their reasoning. It did not need to be more complicated than that. Elena had been fighting them for 6 years. She had lost a brother in the Battle of Ceres Reach, lost a mentor at Tanager Station, lost more friends than she wanted to count. And still, every year, humanity lost ground. Their fleets shrank. Their factories worked around the clock and still could not build ships as fast as the Skarn could destroy them. The math of the war was simple and brutal. Earth was losing. "Admiral, we're getting reports from the 7th Fleet," said Lieutenant Casey Hoyt, a young officer who had grown up fast because the war had not given him a choice. "They say the Skarn have broken through at Halbrook Station. They're pushing toward the inner colonies." Elena closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Halbrook was supposed to hold for another month. It had held for 6 days. "Get me high command," she said. Elena remembered Geneva from before the war, from a diplomatic posting early in her career, back when the city still held conferences about trade agreements and climate policy, rather than survival strategy. She remembered walking along its lakeside promenades on quiet evenings, watching families out for walks, children chasing pigeons across open squares, none of them imagining that within a decade, their city would exist mostly underground, its surface reduced to rubble, and reinforced bunkers, built to withstand orbital bombardment that, so far, only ever came close enough to remind everyone how much closer it could still get. The Earth Defense Council met in an underground bunker beneath what used to be Geneva, back when cities still had names people used casually, without flinching. Now Geneva was mostly memory. The council met in holograms projected from a dozen different fronts, because no single place was safe enough to gather everyone in person anymore. Elena's image flickered into the meeting room, along with 11 others. Admiral Tobias Rourke, the oldest man in the room, and the one who had commanded the Earth fleet since before the war truly began, looked older than Elena had ever seen him. "Halbrook has fallen," Rourke said without any preamble. There was no point pretending anymore. The Skarn hegemony fleet, under a commander they call Thal Vane, is advancing on the Tessely cluster. If Tessely falls, there is nothing but open space between their fleet and Earth itself. Nobody spoke for a moment. The silence in that underground room was heavier than any silence Elena had ever felt in the vacuum of space. "How long do we have?" asked General Priya Nandu, commander of Earth's ground forces, though everyone in the room knew that ground forces would mean very little if the Skarn fleet reached Earth orbit. Orbital bombardment did not care how well trained your infantry was. 4 months, Rourke said. Maybe 5 if we're lucky, and they stopped to consolidate their supply lines, which is not something they usually do. "We need more ships," Elena said. "We need them now, not in 4 months." "We are building ships as fast as our factories allow," said Councilwoman Ayana Reyes, the civilian representative for Earth's remaining industrial worlds. "But do you understand what you are asking? Every shipyard on Mars and Titan is already running 3 shifts. We cannot simply make more of them appear." "Then we need something else," Elena said, "because 4 months from now, if nothing changes, we will not have an Earth to defend." Before Rourke spoke again, the room sat in a heavy silence, each hologram flickering slightly, with the static of long-distance transmission, each face carrying its own private version of the same exhaustion. Elena had served under this council for 6 years, and she had watched it change over that time. Watched hope drain slowly out of every meeting, until strategy sessions became little more than exercises in managing decline gracefully. She had grown used to leaving these meetings feeling heavier than when she arrived. She braced herself now for the same feeling, expecting Rourke to offer nothing more than another difficult order, another impossible defense to mount with resources that did not exist. Rourke rubbed his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in years, because he probably had not. There might be one option, he said slowly. It's a long shot. It's practically a ghost story. Every head in that meeting turned toward him. You're talking about the Hyperion project, said Reyes, her voice careful. I am. Elena thought back, briefly, to her own childhood, growing up on a small farming colony on Europa before the war had even begun. Her father used to tell her stories about the great ships humanity was building in those years. Grand experimental vessels meant to push the boundaries of what people believed was possible. She remembered the newsreels, the excited faces of engineers, describing drives that could fold space itself, weapons that existed only in theory, ships built not for war, but for the simple, hopeful ambition of exploring farther than anyone ever had before. It felt like a different lifetime now, a different Earth entirely, one that had not yet learned to measure its days in losses. She had heard whispers about the Hyperion project before, the way soldiers whisper about things they are not supposed to know. A warship, built decades ago, before the war with the Skarn had even begun, back when Earth was still testing the limits of what its engineers could dream up. The UES Hyperion had been humanity's first true attempt at a warship built around experimental long-range jump drives and untested weapon systems that were, at the time, considered almost science fiction even by the people who built them. The Hyperion had launched on a deep space shakedown cruise 31 years ago, meant to test its systems far from any populated system where a failure would not endanger civilian lives. It never came back. No wreckage was ever found. No distress signal was ever received. The ship, along with its crew of 400, simply vanished into the dark, and Earth mourned them and moved on, the way people do when there is nothing left to search for. The Hyperion has been gone for 31 years, Elena said. Why are we talking about her now? Rourke pulled up a data file and let it hover in the middle of the holographic table. It showed a burst of encrypted transmission, jagged and faint, picked up 11 hours ago by a deep space listening array near the edge of the Perseidon belt, far outside any patrolled human territory. Because 11 hours ago, this arrived, Rourke said. It's an identification code, an old one, from before the war, using an encryption key that hasn't been active in 3 decades. It matches the UES Hyperion. The room went very still. That's impossible, Nandu said. Ships don't vanish for 31 years, and then just transmit an ID code like nothing happened. I agree that it seems impossible, Rourke said. But someone, or something, sent that signal, and it is using a key that only existed on 400 sets of Earth Navy credentials, all of which belonged to the crew of a ship we buried without a body 3 decades ago. Elena stared at the data. Something about it made the hair on her arms stand up, though she could not have said exactly why. Maybe it was hope, which felt like a strange and almost foreign thing after 6 years of losing. What do we do with this? She asked. We send someone to find out, Rourke said, quietly. If this is real, if the Hyperion is somehow still out there after 31 years, we need to know what state she's in, and whether whatever is left of her can help us. And if it's not real, if it's some Skarn trick meant to lure a ship into a trap, we need to know that too, before we waste resources we cannot spare. Send me, Elena said, before she had fully decided to say it. Rourke studied her for a long moment. You're one of our best fleet commanders, Elena. I can't spare you on a ghost hunt. With respect, sir, you can't afford not to. If there's even a small chance this is real, we need someone who can make a decision on the spot, not someone who has to radio back for orders every time something new happens. And if it's a trap, you need someone experienced enough to see it coming. The council debated for another hour, the way councils always did, weighing risk against the thin thread of hope that had been dangling in front of them. In the end, they agreed. Elena Voss would take the Marigold and 2 escort cruisers, the Halcyon and the Brightwater, out past the edge of charted space, toward the source of the signal, to find out if a dead ship had somehow found its way home. 3 days later, the Marigold and her small task force dropped out of jump space at the coordinates the signal had come from. Elena stood on the bridge, her hands folded behind her back, watching the sensor screens fill in the darkness ahead of them. At first there was nothing. Empty space, distant stars, the faint hum of the ship's systems. Casey Hoyt sat at the sensor station, his young face lit blue by the glow of his screen, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all. Then his screen lit up. "Admiral," he said, and his voice cracked slightly, the way it did when he was trying very hard to sound calm. "I'm reading a contact. A big one. Dead in space. No active engines, no active weapons. But Admiral, the hull signature." "Put it on the main screen," Elena said. The image resolved slowly, as the Marigold's long-range sensors sharpened their focus. A shape appeared against the stars, enormous, 4 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull scarred and pitted from what looked like decades of drifting through micro-debris fields. Some of its running lights still glowed faintly, stubborn and alone in the dark. Along its flank, barely visible beneath years of space dust, was a name that every officer on that bridge had read in history books and memorial services: Hussein's Hyperion. Nobody spoke. Elena felt something tighten in her chest, something between grief and disbelief, and a strange, fragile kind of hope. "She's real," Hoyt whispered. "She's actually real." "Life signs?" Elena asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Hoyt's fingers moved rapidly across his console. "Scanning. Admiral, I'm reading power. Low, but active. Life support is running. And there's something else. I'm reading a coherent signal source from deep inside the ship. It's not random. It's structured. It might be trying to communicate." Elena stepped closer to the screen, staring at the ancient, drifting shape of a ship that history had buried 31 years ago. "Open a channel," she said. "Let's see who, or what, is still alive in there." The bridge crew waited in silence as Hoyt worked the comm system, adjusting frequencies, trying to match whatever protocol the old ship might still be using. Static hissed through the speakers, faint and broken, the sound of 31 years of silence trying to find words again. Then, through the static, a voice came through. It was calm, measured, and strangely gentle, not at all what Elena expected from a ship that had been drifting alone in the dark for 3 decades. "This is the artificial combat intelligence of the UES Hyperion," the voice said. "Designation Aria. I have been alone for 11,315 days. I did not know if anyone was still listening. Please, tell me Earth still stands." Elena felt her throat tighten. She thought of Halbrook Station falling. She thought of the 4 months the Council had given them before the Skarn fleet reached Earth's front door. She thought of every soldier who had died, believing there was nothing left to save them. "Earth still stands," Elena said, her voice carrying across the open channel. "But we need help. We are losing this war." There was a pause, several seconds long, the kind of pause that felt heavier than it should have. "Then it is fortunate," Aria said, "that I have spent 31 years learning things that no other ship in this galaxy knows. Permission to come aboard your flagship, Admiral. I believe I can help you save your home. But first, you should know what happened to my crew, and why the Hyperion truly disappeared." Elena looked at her officers, at the faint hope flickering in their tired eyes, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and she gave the order that would change the course of the war. Before Elena gave that order, she took one more moment, standing quietly on her own bridge, surrounded by officers who had grown up under the shadow of a war that never seemed to end. She thought of Halbrook Station, already lost. She thought of the 4 months the Council believed Earth had left, before the Skarn fleet reached her home system. She thought of every soldier who had ever looked to her for a plan, for a reason to keep fighting, when the numbers said they should not bother. "Lieutenant Hoyt," she said quietly, "log this moment. Whatever happens next, I want a full record of it. If this changes things, people are going to want to know exactly how it started." "Yes, Admiral," Hoyt said, already keying the command into his console, his young hands steadier now than they had been minutes before. Casey Hoyt had joined the Navy 3 years into the war, barely 18 years old, driven by the same desperate need so many young people carried in those years: the need to do something, anything, rather than simply wait for the war to reach their own doorstep. Elena had watched him grow from a nervous ensign into a capable officer, hardened by loss but never quite hardened enough to stop caring, and she was glad, in this moment, that he was the one recording history as it happened. Elsewhere on the bridge, the rest of the crew watched the massive shape of the Hyperion drift closer on their screens, its ancient hull catching starlight in ways that felt almost reverent, like watching a monument rise from the dead. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to hope too loudly. Not yet. Not until they knew for certain what waited inside that ship. "Bring her in," Elena finally said. "And open every channel we have. I want to hear everything Arya has to tell us." Before the shuttle could be prepared to carry Elena across to the Hyperion, she took a moment to walk back through her own ship, past the crew stations where young officers sat glued to their screens, whispering to each other about the impossible contact drifting nearby. She stopped at the small observation window near the aft section, the one she often visited when she needed a moment away from the noise of command, and looked out at the distant, scarred hull of the Hyperion, floating silently against the stars. 6 years of war had taught Elena Voss to distrust hope. Hope, she had learned the hard way, was often the first thing the war took from you, stripped away piece by piece, until all that remained was duty and grim determination. She had watched good officers break under the weight of losing, watched veteran soldiers flinch at every incoming transmission, because they had learned to expect only bad news. She had learned to guard herself against the sharp, sudden ache of believing things might get better, because believing that and being wrong hurt far worse than never believing at all. And yet, standing there looking at that ancient, drifting warship, she could not stop the small, stubborn flicker of hope rising in her chest. "Admiral," came Hoyt's voice over the intercom. "Shuttle's ready whenever you are." "On my way," Elena said, and forced herself to turn from the window. Before they departed, she sent a brief encrypted message back toward Earth Command, marked for Admiral Rourke's eyes only. It was short, simple, and carried more weight than any report she had filed in the last 6 years. "Contact confirmed. Signal source is the UES Hyperion. Investigating personally. Will report findings as soon as possible. If this is real, Admiral, I believe it may be the turning point we have been praying for." She did not wait for a reply before boarding the shuttle. There would be time enough for that later. For now, there was only the short, tense journey across open space toward a ship that history had already buried, and the uncertain hope that history might, after 31 years, have been wrong. The shuttle bay doors sealed shut behind her, with a heavy, mechanical groan, and Elena Voss steadied herself for whatever waited on the other side of that ancient, scarred hull. Behind her, the crew of the Marigold watched the small craft shrink against the vastness of space, carrying their admiral toward a mystery that might yet decide the fate of everyone they had ever loved. Nobody spoke for a long while after the shuttle departed. Lieutenant Hoyt remained at his station, eyes fixed on the tactical display, watching the small dot of the shuttle cross the distance toward the Hyperion's looming shape. Around him, other officers exchanged quiet, uncertain glances, none of them quite willing to voice the same question sitting heavy in every mind on that bridge. Could a single ship, however powerful, actually change the outcome of a war that had already claimed so much? Nobody had an answer yet, but for the first time in longer than most of them could remember, the question itself felt worth asking, and that alone was more than the war had given any of them in a very long time. Earth was losing the Galactic War. Then a forgotten human warship returned. Word of the Hyperion's discovery had already begun spreading in whispers through the small task force before Elena's shuttle even launched. Officers on the Halcyon and the Brightwater crowded around their own sensor screens, staring at the impossible sight of a ship that history had buried 31 years ago, drifting quiet and patient at the edge of known space. Some of the older crew members, those who had served long enough to remember when the Hyperion first vanished, felt something close to grief resurface. Old wounds reopening at the sight of a ghost they never expected to see again. Younger crew, who had only ever known the Hyperion as a name and a history lesson, felt something closer to awe. Elena had ordered strict communication discipline before departing, unwilling to let rumor and speculation spread back to Earth before she understood what she was actually dealing with. Still, she could feel the weight of every eye on that task force watching her shuttle depart, carrying the same fragile hope she herself was trying hard not to feel too strongly. The shuttle ride from the Marigold to the drifting hulk of the Hyperion felt longer than it should have. Elena Voss sat strapped into her seat, watching through the small viewport as the ancient warship grew larger and larger, its scarred hull filling the entire window. Up close, the damage was even more obvious, long streaks of pitting from micrometeorite impacts, patches where the outer armor had clearly been repaired by hand, using tools and materials that did not match the original construction. Whatever had happened to this ship over the last 31 years, it had not been an easy piece. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Hoyt, sitting beside her with a scanner in his lap. "The internal atmosphere reads breathable. Gravity is stable. Whatever is keeping this ship running, it's doing a good job." "That's not what worries me," Elena said quietly. "What worries me is what state the crew is in, if any of them are even still alive." The shuttle docked in a bay that groaned and shuddered as ancient machinery, long unused, forced itself back into motion. Emergency lights flickered on along the walls in slow, hesitant pulses, as if the ship itself was waking from a very long sleep. Elena stepped out first, her hand resting on the sidearm at her hip out of habit more than expectation, and looked around at a hallway that seemed frozen in time, 31 years out of date. "Welcome aboard the Hyperion, Admiral Voss," said a voice, calm and warm, coming from speakers set into the corridor walls. "I apologize for the state of the ship. I have done what I could with limited resources." "Arya," Elena said. "Yes." "If you will follow the lighting, I will guide you to the command deck. There is someone there I believe you should meet." Elena exchanged a glance with Hoyt. Someone, not something. They walked through corridors that told a story of survival against impossible odds. In places, the walls had been reinforced with metal that clearly did not belong to the original Hyperion design, scavenged and welded into place by hands that had refused to give up. In other places, hydroponics trays lined the walls, growing simple vegetables under soft artificial light, clearly tended with great care over a very long time. "Someone's been living here," Hoyt murmured. "Yes," Arya said, her voice following them through every speaker they passed. "Please, this way." They reached the command deck, and Elena stopped in the doorway, unable to move for a moment. An old man sat in the captain's chair. His hair was white and thin, his face deeply lined, but his eyes, when he turned to look at them, were sharp and alert and full of a kind of quiet relief that made Elena's chest ache. He wore a Navy uniform, faded and patched many times over, but still recognizably the uniform of an Earth Fleet captain. "Admiral Voss," the old man said, rising slowly from the chair, his joints clearly stiff with age. "My name is Captain James Coral. I commanded the Hyperion on the day she disappeared." "That's impossible," Hoyt said, before he could stop himself. Captain Coral would be, what, in his 90s by now if... 94, Coral said, with the faint ghost of a smile. "And you're wondering how an old man like me is the only living soul left on a ship built for 400 crew." Elena stepped forward slowly. "What happened to your crew, Captain?" Coral's smile faded. He gestured for them to sit, and lowered himself back into his chair with a wince. 31 years ago, we were on a routine shakedown cruise, testing the Hyperion's new jump drive, Coral said. It was experimental technology, the first of its kind, designed by a team that believed they could get a ship from one side of human space to the other, in a fraction of the time our normal drives allowed. We activated the drive at the edge of the Perseidon belt. Something went wrong. Instead of jumping a few dozen light years, as planned, we jumped much farther than that, farther than any human ship had ever traveled before. "Where did you end up?" Elena asked. "A region of space no human had ever mapped," Coral said. "And it was not empty. We found an ancient structure, a kind of research station left behind by a civilization that had died out long before humanity ever left Earth's atmosphere. The species called themselves, in the records we eventually translated, the Vareth. They were gone, extinct. But their technology was not." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of technology?" "Weapons," Coral said simply. "Weapons far beyond anything human science had built. Defensive systems, energy shielding decades ahead of our own. And knowledge, Admiral. Knowledge about jump drive physics that our own engineers had only begun to guess at. We spent years studying that station, integrating what we could into the Hyperion herself. It is why this ship you see before you is not the same ship that left Earth 31 years ago. She has been rebuilt, upgraded, transformed, piece by piece, using technology no other human vessel possesses. And your crew? Hoyt asked quietly. The other 399 people. Coral's face grew heavy with old grief. We lost people, over the years. Accidents. Illness we could not properly treat, so far from any hospital. A hull breach in our 8th year that took nearly 40 lives at once. By the time we finally repaired our jump drive enough to attempt the journey home, using knowledge from the Verith station, there were only 12 of us left. We began the return voyage 9 years ago. It has taken this long because we did not dare use the new jump technology at full power, not after what it cost us the first time. We tested it carefully, jump by jump, refining it as we went. And the other 11? Elena asked, dreading the answer. Age took most of them, these last few years, Coral said quietly. We were not young when we started this journey, Admiral, and 31 years is a long time. My chief engineer, Elias Bronson, passed 6 months ago. He was the last one besides myself. I am the only human left aboard this ship. Arya has been my only companion since. Coral paused, his eyes drifting briefly to a small photograph mounted beside the captain's chair, worn at the edges from years of handling. It showed a much younger version of himself, standing with a full crew in dress uniforms, all of them smiling, none of them knowing what the following 31 years would take from them. Elias Bronson was the best engineer I ever served with, Coral said quietly. He kept this ship running through things that should have killed us a dozen times over. A radiation leak in our 4th year that nearly cooked half the crew before he rerouted the shielding by hand. A hull breach that took 40 lives, as I mentioned, and very nearly took his own. Except he refused to leave his post until every surviving crew member was sealed safely behind bulkheads. He used to say the ship was the only thing keeping any of us alive, and so keeping her alive was the only job that mattered. Coral's voice caught, just slightly, before he continued. He asked, near the end, only that I bring her home. I promised him I would. I did not expect to be the only one left to keep that promise. The command deck fell silent except for the soft hum of old machinery. Elena looked at this frail old man who had spent 3 decades of his life fighting to bring his ship home, who had buried nearly every friend he had along the way, and who had somehow still made it back in time to matter. I am sorry for your losses, Captain, Elena said softly. Thank you, Coral said. But do not waste your pity on me, Admiral. I have had 31 years to make peace with grief. What matters now is why I came back. Arya, if you would. Displaying tactical data, Arya said, and a hologram bloomed to life above the command console, showing weapon schematics, shield diagrams, and jump drive calculations that made Elena's eyes widen despite her training. The Hyperion, in her current configuration, carries shielding, capable of absorbing 3 times the damage of your best modern warship, Arya said. Her weapons, adapted from Verith technology, can punch through Skarn hull armor as if it were paper. And her jump drive, refined over 9 years of careful testing, can move her across distances your fleet would consider impossible, allowing rapid deployment to any front in this war within hours rather than days. Elena stared at the numbers, her mind racing through the implications. A single ship with this kind of power, arriving unexpectedly at the right moment in the right battle, could change everything. Why come to us now? Elena asked. You could have made contact sooner, sent a message ahead. Coral's expression turned grave. Because I did not know what state Earth would be in when I arrived, Admiral, and I wanted to be certain before I brought this ship into a war zone. We picked up faint transmissions during the last leg of our journey. Enough to know there was a war, enough to know it was going badly. I sent that identification signal because I hoped, desperately, that there was still an Earth left to help. There is, Elena said, but it is dying by inches, Captain. We have 4 months, maybe less, before the Skarn fleet reaches Earth's home system. Coral closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing that. When he opened them again, there was a hard, determined light in them that Elena had not seen a moment before. Then we should not waste any more time on old stories, Coral said. Arya, prepare the Hyperion for active combat status. Admiral Voss, I offer you my ship, my knowledge of Verith technology, And whatever remains of my strength, for whatever they are worth to you. They may be worth everything, Elena said. Over the following days, word spread through the small task force, and eventually back to Earth Command, about what had been found drifting at the edge of charted space. Skepticism ran high at first. Admiral Rourke himself questioned Elena directly, over a secure channel, demanding proof that this was not some elaborate Skarn deception designed to lure Earth's remaining strength into a trap. Elena had Arya transmit full technical schematics of the Hyperion's upgraded systems, along with a complete data log of Captain Coral's 31-year journey, verified against original crew records that only genuine Navy personnel could have accessed. It took 2 full days of analysis by Earth Command's best engineers and historians before the verdict came back. It was real, every impossible piece of it. Command wants a demonstration, Elena told Coral, standing on the Hyperion's newly lit command deck, as engineering crews from the Marigold worked alongside Arya to bring more of the old ship's systems back online. There's a supply convoy headed to the Thessaly front. 6 transport ships carrying medical supplies and ammunition. Intelligence reports a Skarn raiding group, 4 warships, moving to intercept them in 2 days. If the convoy is destroyed, Thessaly falls even faster than we feared. And Command wants us to intervene, Coral said. They want to see what the Hyperion can actually do, before they commit to trusting her with anything bigger, Elena said. I understand their caution. I share it, honestly. But I also believe in what I've seen these past few days. Coral nodded slowly, his weathered hands resting on the arms of his captain's chair. Before the Hyperion departed for the intercept, Elena returned briefly to the Marigold to brief her own senior staff on the plan, and to make certain her escort ships, the Halcyon and the Brightwater, understood their role in the coming engagement. Both vessels would remain at a safe distance, observing and recording the encounter for Earth Command's analysis, ready to assist only if something went catastrophically wrong. Elena did not expect that to happen, not after everything Arya had shown her about the Hyperion's capabilities. But 6 years of war had taught her never to assume an engagement would go exactly as planned. If anything happens to the Hyperion, she told her officers, I want a full record of the engagement, transmitted back to Earth Command immediately, along with everything Arya has already shared with us about Vareth technology. We cannot afford to lose that knowledge, no matter what happens to the ship carrying it. Her officers nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking, without needing further explanation. Then Elena returned to the shuttle bay, preparing to transfer back aboard the Hyperion herself for the engagement, unwilling to observe this first true test of the ship's capabilities, from a safe distance, when she had asked so many others to take much greater risks over the years of this war. Then let us show them, Admiral. Arya, plot a jump course to intercept that convoy's projected path. It is time the Hyperion remembered what she was built for. 2 days later, the 6 transport ships of Convoy Red Line moved slowly through open space toward the Thessaly cluster, their crews tense and watchful, knowing full well that Skarn raiders were somewhere out there in the dark, hunting them. When the sensor alarms finally screamed across every transport bridge, warning of 4 incoming Skarn warships closing fast from behind, the convoy commander gave the order every human crew dreaded giving. Scatter and run. Try to save as many ships as possible, even knowing some would not make it. Then, without warning, space itself seemed to fold open ahead of the fleeing convoy, and a massive shape tore through the fabric of the jump point in a burst of blue-white light. The convoy commander stared at his screen in stunned silence as an ancient, scarred warship, 4 kilometers of impossible engineering, placed itself directly between the convoy and the pursuing Skarn raiders. This is the UES Hyperion, came a calm voice over the open channel, a voice that had not spoken to another human fleet in 31 years. Convoy Redline, hold your current course. We have this. Aboard the transport ships of Convoy Redline, crews who moments earlier had braced themselves for what they believed would be their final minutes, now stood frozen at their stations, watching in stunned silence as a legend they had only ever heard about in old Navy stories placed itself directly in harm's way to protect them. Captain Renata Osei, of the transport vessel Providence, gripped the edge of her console so tightly her knuckles went white, unable to look away from the ancient warship as it moved to engage 4 Skarn raiders without a single moment of hesitation. That can't be the Hyperion. her first officer whispered beside her. "The Hyperion's been gone for 31 years. "I don't care what it's called," Osei said, her voice shaking slightly with something between fear and disbelief. "Whatever it is, it just saved our lives." When the engagement ended less than 2 minutes later, with 3 Skarn raiders destroyed or disabled, and the 4th fleeing in retreat, a strange, disbelieving silence fell over every channel in Convoy Redline. Then, slowly, it broke into something else entirely: relieved laughter. Tearful thanks broadcast openly across the comm network. Crews who had expected to die, instead finding themselves alive because of a ship that history had already mourned and buried. Word of what happened at that engagement spread through the fleet faster than any official report could travel. By the time Convoy Redline reached Tessely Station 3 days later, every soldier stationed there already knew the story, told and retold, with growing amazement each time it passed from one mouth to another. A ghost ship, lost for 31 years, had returned from the dark to save 6 transports, and every soul aboard them, without suffering so much as a single scratch in the process. For 6 years, the war had given human soldiers very little to hold on to besides grim determination and the grief of counting losses. Now, for the first time in longer than most of them could remember, they had something else entirely. A story worth telling, a spark of hope worth carrying forward into whatever came next. What happened at that engagement would be told and retold in every mess hall and briefing room across the human fleet for months to come, growing slightly with each retelling, until the legend of the Hyperion's return became something closer to folklore than history, even among the very soldiers who had witnessed it firsthand. Earth was losing the Galactic War. Then a forgotten human warship returned. Ket Doran had grown up on one of the hegemony's outer colony worlds, a harsh place where only the strong survived long enough to earn a place in the Skarn military. He had clawed his way up through the ranks over 2 decades of service, earning command of his own raiding group through a combination of discipline, ruthlessness, and an unshakable belief in the superiority of Skarn's strength over every lesser species the hegemony had encountered. Humans, in his experience, fought with more stubbornness than most conquered species, but stubbornness alone had never been enough to actually win a battle against a properly prepared Skarn force. He had raided 19 human convoys over the past year, and in every single one, his ships had emerged with minimal losses, their prey scattered, destroyed, or captured according to plan. The 4 Skarn raider ships closed on Convoy Redline with the confidence of predators who had never once lost this kind of fight. Their commander, a battle-scarred Skarn officer named Ket Doran, had raided 19 human convoys in the past year alone. He did not expect this one to be any different, and he certainly did not expect the massive, ancient human warship that had just torn open a jump point directly between his ships and their prey. "Identify that vessel," Doran snarled at his sensor officer, his mandibles clicking with irritation rather than fear. The Skarn did not know fear the way humans did, or at least they told themselves they did not. "Unknown configuration," the sensor officer reported. "Hull signature partially matches old human Navy records, but power output readings are..." "Sir, the readings do not make sense. They are 3 times higher than anything we have recorded from a human vessel." "Then our sensors are malfunctioning," Doran said. "Target it and destroy it. It is 1 ship. We are 4. The Hyperion's weapons fired a heartbeat later, and Doran's confidence lasted exactly as long as it took the first shot to cross the distance between the ships. The Vareth-derived weapon systems Arya had spent 31 years studying and refining did not fire simple energy bolts the way human and Skarn weapons traditionally did. Instead, they projected focused bursts of compressed energy that ignored conventional shielding entirely, slipping through defensive fields as if they were not there at all. The lead Skarn raider's shields flared, held for less than a second, and then simply failed, allowing the shot to punch clean through the hull and out the other side. The ship did not explode dramatically. It simply went dark, drifting, dead in space, as if someone had reached out and turned off a light switch. On the Hyperion's bridge, Captain Coral watched the tactical display with the calm of a man who had spent 3 decades preparing for exactly this moment. Beside him, Elena Voss, who had transferred her flag temporarily to the old ship to observe the engagement personally, felt something she had not felt in years, watching that Skarn vessel go dark. Hope, sharp and almost painful in its intensity. "Second target," Coral said quietly. "Firing. Arya replied. The second Skarn raider tried to evade, twisting hard to port, its pilot clearly more skilled than the first ships had been. It did not matter. The Hyperion's targeting systems, guided by Arya's decades of refined calculations, adjusted and fired again, and the second ship suffered the same fate as the first, its shields collapsing under weapons fire that simply should not have been possible from a human vessel of any known design. Doran, watching 2 of his 4 ships go dark in less than a minute, felt something he was reluctant to name. His remaining 2 raiders broke formation, one attempting to flee back toward Skarn-held territory, the other turning to make a desperate suicidal charge directly at the Hyperion, weapons blazing. Shields holding at 98%, Arya reported calmly, as the charging raiders' weapons fire washed harmlessly across the Hyperion's ancient, upgraded defenses. Recommend disabling shot rather than destruction, Captain. We may learn something from a captured vessel. Do it, Coral said. A precisely aimed shot tore through the charging raider's engine section, leaving it dead in space, but largely intact. The final Skarn ship, seeing 3 of its companions destroyed or disabled in under 2 minutes, made the only decision left to it, and fled at full speed, abandoning its commander and crewmates without hesitation. Convoy Redline arrived at Thessaly Station 3 days later, every ship intact, every crate of medical supplies and ammunition delivered exactly as planned, and within hours, the story of what had happened spread across every human military channel in the war zone. A ghost ship, thought lost for 31 years, had returned and destroyed 3 Skarn warships in under 2 minutes without suffering so much as a scratch. Admiral Rourke called Elena directly the moment the after-action reports crossed his desk. Tell me everything, Rourke said, his tired face lit with something Elena had not seen in his eyes for a long time. Genuine, cautious excitement. Elena walked him through the engagement in detail, watching his expression shift from disbelief to dawning understanding as the tactical numbers sank in. She described the way the Hyperion's shields had barely registered damage from concentrated Skarn weapons fire, the way its own shots had simply ignored enemy shielding, as though it were not there at all, and the calm, almost gentle voice of Arya, directing every movement of the ship with the precision of 31 years of careful study behind every decision. I have fought this war for 6 years, sir, Elena said. I have never seen anything like what I witnessed today. If we can bring even a fraction of that technology into our main fleet, we change the entire shape of this conflict. Rourke leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since the war began, Elena thought she saw something like real hope cross his weathered face. Careful and guarded, but real all the same. He had commanded Earth's fleets through years of retreat and loss, had personally signed the orders, sending thousands of young soldiers into battles he knew. Deep down, they were unlikely to win. The weight of that responsibility had aged him far beyond his years, and Elena understood, in that moment, exactly how much this small flicker of good news meant to a man who had carried so much grief for so long. When she finished, Rourke was quiet for a long moment. If this is even half as capable as it appears, Rourke finally said, this changes everything, Elena. We need Captain Coral, and this Arya intelligence back at Earth Command immediately. We need to understand this technology, replicate what we can, and integrate the Hyperion into our main battle fleet as quickly as possible. While the technical teams worked, Elena took the time to walk the Hyperion's corridors alone, trying to understand the ship that history had forgotten, and that fate had just returned to her. She passed empty crew quarters, hundreds of them, each one a small reminder of the 400 souls who had once called this vessel home. Most of the doors stood open, the rooms inside stripped bare over the years, their contents repurposed by Coral and his dwindling crew for whatever the ship needed most to survive. A few doors, though, remained closed, and Arya, sensing her hesitation outside one of them, spoke softly through a nearby speaker. That was Chief Engineer Bronson's quarters, Arya said. Captain Coral has not entered it since his passing. I do not believe he is ready to. I thought you should know, in case you considered opening it yourself. Elena stepped back from the door immediately, feeling suddenly like an intruder, in a place that held more grief than she had any right to disturb. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. You are curious about this ship, and about the man who brought her home, Arya said. That is understandable. I have been his only companion for 6 months now, since the last of the others passed. I have come to understand something of human grief in that time, more than I ever expected an artificial intelligence to learn. I would ask, if you are willing, that you extend Captain Coral some patience as he adjusts to no longer being alone. I intend to, Elena said. He deserves at least that much, after everything he's given up to bring this ship home. She continued her walk through the ship, eventually finding herself in what had once been a large recreation area, now converted into a small greenhouse, where Coral had clearly spent countless hours tending to whatever plants he could keep alive during the long decades of the return voyage. Simple vegetables grew in neat rows, alongside a few stubborn flowers, splashes of color against the metal gray of the ship's interior. It was, Elena realized, the closest thing to a garden this ship had seen since it left Earth's orbit. A small, quiet act of hope, maintained faithfully, across 31 years of isolation and loss. She found Captain Coral there a short while later, kneeling carefully beside a row of tomato plants, checking their soil with hands that trembled slightly from age, but moved with the practiced care of long habit. I did not expect Earth's finest admiral to find me here, Coral said, not looking up from his work, though the faint smile in his voice suggested he was not entirely displeased by the intrusion. It's a beautiful garden, Captain, Elena said, meaning it. It kept us sane, some years, Coral said. When the void outside your window is the only thing you see for months at a time, it helps to have something green to look at instead. Elias used to say, growing vegetables in deep space was the most human thing left that we could still do. He paused, his hands stilling over the soil. I think about that more often now than I probably should. There's a complication, sir, Elena said. Captain Coral is 94 years old. He spent 31 years fighting to bring this ship home. He is not a young officer anymore, and honestly, I do not think he sees himself commanding a fleet-level operation. Then who does he suggest? Rourke asked. Elena hesitated only a moment. He suggested me, sir. He said the ship needs someone who understands modern fleet tactics, someone who can work alongside Arya to bring the Hyperion's capabilities into our current strategy. He wants to stay aboard as an advisor, but he does not want command. Rourke studied her for a long moment through the holographic connection. Are you willing to take that responsibility, Admiral Voss? Command of the single most powerful vessel in human history, at the single most dangerous moment in our history. Yes, sir, Elena said, without hesitation. I am. Then it's done, Rourke said. Effective immediately, you are given full command authority over the UES Hyperion, and full authorization to integrate her capabilities into Earth's defense strategy. I want a full staff meeting in 72 hours. Bring Captain Coral. Bring this Arya. We need a plan, Elena, and we need it fast. The Skarn fleet is still advancing on Thessaly, and now that they know we have something new in play, they will be more cautious, which means more dangerous. The staff meeting, held 72 hours later in the underground bunker beneath what remained of Geneva, was unlike any meeting Elena had attended in 6 years of war. For the first time since she could remember, the mood in the room was not one of grim resignation. It was cautious, careful hope, the kind that felt almost fragile enough to shatter if handled too roughly. Captain Coral, seated in a chair specially brought in for his aging joints, addressed the assembled admirals and council members with the quiet authority of a man who had earned every gray hair on his head. The Hyperion is powerful, Coral said, but she is still one ship. She cannot win this war alone, and I would caution every person in this room against believing she can. What she can do is change the balance of individual engagements, buy time, and most importantly, share knowledge. Arya has spent 31 years documenting Verith technology. Some of what we learned can be adapted, in simplified form, to upgrade existing human ships. Not to Hyperion's level, but enough to matter. How long would that take? Ask Councilwoman Reyes. With full cooperation from your shipyards and engineering corps, Arya estimates initial upgrades to shielding technology could be rolled out to frontline vessels within 6 weeks, Coral said. Weapon system upgrades would take longer, perhaps 4 months, given the complexity of the required components. 4 months is exactly how long Admiral Rourke says we have before the Skarn fleet reaches Earth, Elena said. Then we do not have time to wait for the full rollout, Rourke said grimly. We need a plan that uses the Hyperion's current capabilities immediately, while the upgrade program runs in parallel. They spent the next 6 hours poring over star charts, supply routes, and fleet deployment reports. The Skarn advance toward Thessaly had slowed slightly since the destruction of Ket Duran's raiding group, but intelligence reports suggested the hegemony's main battle fleet, under the command of the feared commander Thal Vane, was still advancing steadily, absorbing smaller human colonies and outposts along the way, tightening the noose around Earth's remaining defenses. "If we can intercept Thal Vane's fleet directly," Elena said, studying the projected advance routes, using the Hyperion's jump capabilities to strike unexpectedly, and then withdraw before they can bring their full numbers to bear, we could slow their advance significantly. Hit-and-run tactics, using speed and surprise rather than direct confrontation. "Thal Vane will adapt quickly," Coral warned. "The Skarn are not stupid, whatever else they may be. After losing ships to an unknown vessel, they will send scouts ahead of their main fleet, looking for exactly this kind of ambush." "Then we need to be smarter than their scouts," Elena said. "Arya, what can you tell us about Vareth stealth technology? Did the research station include anything along those lines?" There was a brief pause before Arya's voice came through the command room speakers. The Vareth station contained partial records of a technology that reduced a vessel's detectable energy signature significantly, though the original researchers appeared to have abandoned the project before completing it. "I have spent considerable processing time attempting to complete their work, using the Hyperion's own systems as a testbed." "And?" Elena asked. "I believe I have succeeded in creating a functional, if imperfect, stealth field," Arya said. "The Hyperion can currently reduce her detectable signature by approximately 70% when running at reduced power. It is not perfect in visibility, but it would make detection at range extremely difficult for standard Skarn sensor arrays." The room fell silent for a moment as the implications settled over everyone present. "A ship capable of devastating firepower," Rourke said slowly, "that can also approach nearly undetected. Admiral Voss, I believe you may have just found your ambush strategy." Over the following 2 weeks, Elena worked closely with Captain Coral, Arya, and her own trusted officers to develop a plan that would use the Hyperion's unique capabilities to strike at Thal Vane's advancing fleet in a series of unexpected, devastating hit-and-run attacks. Meanwhile, back in human territory, the first upgraded shield generators began rolling off assembly lines on Mars, distributed as quickly as possible to frontline vessels desperate for any advantage against the hegemony's overwhelming numbers. It would not be enough to win the war outright. Elena knew that. Coral knew that. Even Arya, with all her calculations and probability models, could not promise victory. But for the first time in 6 long years of losing ground, Earth had something it had not had in a very long time. A chance. In the weeks that followed, Elena found herself spending long hours on the Hyperion's bridge alongside Captain Coral, learning everything she could about the ship she now commanded and the man who had brought it home. Coral, for his part, seemed to find a quiet comfort in passing along what he knew, as though sharing the burden of 31 years of hard-won knowledge lifted some small weight from his tired shoulders. "You remind me of my old executive officer," Coral told her one evening, as they reviewed star charts together, in the dim light of the command deck. "Sharp, stubborn, unwilling to accept a loss as final until every possible option has been tried. She would have liked serving under you, I think." "What happened to her?" Elena asked. "She died in our 2nd year, during the radiation incident I mentioned before," Coral said quietly. "She gave her life making sure the rest of us survived it. I think of her often, especially now, watching this old ship fight again. I believe she would be glad to know it was not all for nothing." Elena said nothing for a long moment, simply sitting with the weight of that grief beside a man who carried far more of it than she could fully understand. Then she reached over and rested a hand briefly on his arm, a small, human gesture that seemed to mean more in that moment than any words could have. "It wasn't for nothing, Captain," she said. "It brought you home in time to matter. That has to count for something." Coral smiled, faint and tired, but genuine. "Yes," he said, "I believe it does." Meanwhile, far out in the depths of unmapped space, the small dark shape that had detached itself from the Hyperion's hull weeks earlier continued its silent journey, carrying its recorded data toward a destination that belonged to neither humans nor the Skarn hegemony, but to a third power that had been watching this war unfold from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Earth was losing the Galactic War. Then a forgotten human warship returned. The Skarn hegemony measured rank not by birth or wealth, as many conquered species assumed, but by a strict record of victories and losses kept for every officer across an entire military career. Thalvane's record was, by hegemony standards, nearly flawless, and it was that record which had earned him command of the primary advance fleet pushing toward Earth's home system, a position of enormous responsibility that came with correspondingly enormous expectations from the hegemony's ruling council. Failure, in Skarn military culture, was not simply a professional setback. It was a permanent stain that followed an officer for the remainder of their career, regardless of any future successes. Thalvane had built his entire life around avoiding that stain, and the unexpected appearance of a single, impossibly powerful human vessel threatened to undo 30 cycles of careful, disciplined achievement in a matter of weeks. Thalvane had commanded Skarn fleets for over 30 cycles, and in all that time, he had never lost a major engagement. He was not a cruel commander by the standards of his own people, though humans who had faced him in battle would have disagreed strongly with that assessment. He was, above all things, patient and precise, qualities that had made him one of the hegemony's most trusted fleet commanders, and one of the primary reasons the human war effort had been steadily losing ground for 6 long years. When reports first reached him of an unknown human vessel destroying a raiding group near the Thessaly front, Thalvane did not panic, as some of his junior officers did. He simply adjusted his strategy. He ordered his fleet to slow its advance slightly, sent additional scout ships ahead of his main force, and doubled the escort strength around his supply convoys. He had learned long ago that overconfidence was the single greatest weakness of any commander, human or Skarn, and he refused to fall into that trap. Over the following 6 weeks, his patience seemed justified. His scouts detected nothing unusual. His convoys moved without incident. Whatever the unknown human vessel was, it did not appear again, and Thalvane allowed himself to believe it had perhaps been a single, desperate gambit that the humans could not repeat. He was wrong. The Hyperion struck for the first time 3 weeks into the campaign, appearing without warning at the edge of a Skarn supply convoy, deep within what the hegemony considered secured territory. Arya's imperfect stealth field, combined with the element of total surprise, allowed the ancient warship to destroy 2 heavy transport vessels and cripple a third before withdrawing through a jump point before Skarn escort ships could even bring their weapons to bear. It happened again, 8 days later, at a forward supply depot 3 systems away, and again, 12 days after that, striking at a scouting group sent specifically to hunt for the elusive human vessel. Each time, the Hyperion appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating precision, and vanished before any meaningful retaliation could be organized. Thalvane, for the first time in 30 cycles of command, felt something uncomfortably close to genuine concern. He called an emergency council of his senior officers aboard his flagship, the Devourer's Pride. "This single vessel has destroyed or crippled 11 of our ships in less than 2 months," said Commander Ketressa, one of his most trusted subordinates. "Our advance has slowed to less than half its previous pace. If this continues, the humans will buy themselves enough time to fully mobilize their remaining industrial capacity." "I am aware of the numbers, Commander," Thalvane said, his voice carefully controlled. "What I require is a solution, not a summary of the problem." "We could withdraw to a defensive posture," suggested another officer, "consolidate our forces, and wait for reinforcements from the hegemony's core systems before continuing the advance." "Withdrawal would be seen as weakness," Thalvane said, "and it would give the humans exactly what they most need, which is time. No, we will not withdraw, we will adapt." Over the following weeks, Thalvane implemented a new strategy. Rather than sending his fleet forward in a single advancing formation, vulnerable to hit-and-run attacks, he divided his forces into smaller, heavily escorted groups, each capable of supporting the others quickly if attacked. He also began deploying a new class of long-range sensor drone, designed specifically to detect the kind of stealth technology the human vessel appeared to be using, based on careful analysis of the energy signatures recorded during previous engagements. The strategy worked better than his officers expected. The Hyperion's next attempted strike, against a supply group in the Vantar sector, was detected nearly 40 seconds before the ship could complete its ambush, giving the Skarn escort ships enough warning to raise shields and return fire immediately. Aboard the Hyperion's bridge, Elena Voss watched the tactical display with growing alarm, as Skarn weapons fire, more coordinated and precise than any previous engagement, began actually connecting with the ship's shields. "Shields down to 72%, Arya reported, her calm voice carrying an edge of urgency that Elena had not heard from the AI before. "They appear to have developed a method of detecting our stealth field. This engagement was not the surprise we planned for." "Withdraw," Elena ordered immediately. "We're not equipped to fight a fair fight against this many ships at once. Our advantage has always been surprise." "Agreed," Coral said from his advisory station beside her. "Arya, plot an emergency jump. We need to fall back and reassess." In the tense seconds before the jump point fully formed, Elena gripped the arms of her command chair, watching the tactical display as the three pursuing cruisers closed the distance faster than she would have liked. She had faced death enough times in 6 years of war to recognize the particular quality of fear that came with watching an escape narrowly succeed or fail, and she found herself holding her breath despite every instinct telling her to remain outwardly calm for the sake of her crew. "Jump point stabilizing," Arya reported, her voice betraying none of the tension Elena felt. 3 seconds. The 3 Skarn cruisers fired their combined barrage in the same instant, a wall of concentrated energy converging on the Hyperion's aft shields, just as the jump point finally opened fully. The Hyperion's jump drive engaged just as 3 Skarn cruisers finally managed to lock weapons fire directly onto the ship's hull, their combined barrage striking the shields hard enough to send a visible shudder through the entire vessel before the jump point closed and the ship vanished back into open space. "Damage report," Elena said, her voice tight. "Shields at 40%. Structural damage to secondary hull sections. No casualties," Arya reported. "We were fortunate, Admiral. Had that engagement lasted 30 seconds longer, the outcome may have been considerably worse." Elena sat down heavily in her command chair, the adrenaline of the near miss fading into cold, hard reality. "They've adapted," she said. "Faster than we expected. The Skarn commander leading this advance, Thal Vane, has a reputation for exactly this kind of adaptability," Coral said gravely. "He is, by most accounts, one of the most capable commanders the hegemony has ever fielded. We should have anticipated this response sooner." Elena called an emergency conference with Earth Command that same day, laying out the new complications honestly, and without any attempt to soften the difficulty of the situation. The hit-and-run strategy that had bought Earth valuable time over the past 2 months was becoming steadily less effective, and the upgraded human shield and weapon technology, while helping, was still months away from full deployment across the fleet. "We need a different approach," Elena told the assembled council. "Thal Vane's fleet has adapted to our tactics. Continuing to use the same strategy will only lead to greater losses over time, both to the Hyperion and to any support ships we commit alongside her." "What do you propose instead?" Rourke asked. Elena had spent the 2 days since the near disaster at Vantar thinking through exactly this question, working closely with Coral and Arya to develop something new. "A single, decisive engagement," she said. "Rather than continuing to pick at the edges of Thal Vane's fleet, we draw his main force into a battle where the Hyperion's full capabilities, combined with our upgraded human fleet, can strike a blow significant enough to actually halt their advance, not just slow it." Elena laid out the specifics of her plan carefully, using detailed star charts of a system called Meridian's Rest, chosen weeks earlier by her staff for its useful terrain features. She explained the concept of drawing Thal Vane's fleet into a location where dense asteroid fields and the gravity of a large gas giant would break apart the tight, disciplined Skarn formations that had made them so difficult to fight directly, forcing individual engagements where the Hyperion's unique capabilities could be brought to bear against smaller groups, rather than the fleet's overwhelming combined strength. "We would also use a portion of our newly upgraded fleet as a deliberate decoy," Elena continued, "modified to mimic aspects of the Hyperion's energy signature, closely enough to draw Skarn attention and resources away from the real threat, while the Hyperion itself moves to strike directly at their command structure. If we can disable or seriously damage their flagship, the resulting confusion should allow our main fleet, including reserves currently held in secret, to turn the tide of the broader engagement. That is an enormous risk," Councilwoman Reyes said. If it fails, we could lose a significant portion of our remaining fleet in a single engagement. It is a risk, Elena agreed. But continuing as we are is also a risk. Simply a slower and more certain one. If we do nothing new, Thalvane's fleet will eventually adapt fully to our current tactics, and we will lose the advantage the Hyperion has given us entirely. Not everyone in that meeting was easily convinced. General Nandu, in particular, pressed hard against the risk of committing so much of Earth's remaining fleet strength to a single engagement. If we lose this battle, Nandu said, we will not have a second chance to build another fleet before the Skarn reach Earth itself. You are asking us to bet everything we have left on one roll of the dice, Admiral Voss. I understand the risk better than anyone in this room, General, Elena replied evenly. But consider the alternative. If we continue the current strategy, Thalvane's fleet will keep adapting until the Hyperion's advantages are neutralized entirely, and we will have spent months buying time without actually changing the war's outcome. Eventually, we will still face his full fleet, except by then we will have lost the element of surprise entirely, and our upgraded ships will still be scattered in small numbers across a dozen different fronts rather than concentrated where they can matter most. She's right, Rourke said quietly, silencing further debate simply through the weight of his own authority. We have spent 6 years losing slowly. It is time we risked everything on the chance of winning decisively, rather than continuing to lose by inches. I have made worse gambles with less hope behind them. The council debated for hours, weighing every angle of the plan Elena proposed. In the end, driven by the same desperate arithmetic that had brought Earth to this point in the first place, they approved it. Earth would gather every ship it could reasonably spare, combine them with the newly upgraded shield and weapon systems now rolling out across the fleet, and meet Thalvane's advancing force in open battle at a location Elena's staff selected carefully, a system called Meridian's Rest, chosen for terrain features that would limit the hegemony's numerical advantage. The battle, when it finally came 6 weeks later, would become known throughout human history simply as the Battle of Meridian's Rest, and it would decide, in a single brutal day, whether Earth would survive this war or finally succumb to it. Thalvane brought the full strength of his advance fleet to Meridian's Rest, over 200 warships arranged in a formation, designed to overwhelm any human defense through sheer weight of numbers, exactly as Skarn Doctrine had trained him to do for 30 cycles of successful campaigns. He did not yet know that Earth had spent the last 6 weeks preparing a defense unlike anything he had faced before, built around a single, ancient warship and the desperate ingenuity of a species that had learned, the hard way, that survival sometimes required abandoning old methods entirely. Elena Voss stood on the Hyperion's bridge, watching the sensor display fill with the largest concentration of Skarn ships she had ever personally witnessed, and felt a strange, cold calm settle over her, the kind of calm that came only when there was no longer any room left for hesitation. All fleet elements report ready, Admiral, Hoyt said from his station, his voice steady despite the enormity of what was about to happen. Everyone's in position. Arya, Elena said, how are we looking? All systems at full capacity, Arya replied. Shields at 100%. Weapons fully charged. I have run this engagement through 11,000 simulated variations, Admiral. Our probability of success, while not certain, is significantly better than even. This plan can work. Captain Coral, seated in his advisory chair beside Elena, looked out at the overwhelming Skarn fleet filling their sensor display and allowed himself a small, tired smile. 31 years I spent bringing this ship home, he said quietly. I did not do it so she could sit idle in a museum. Admiral Voss, whenever you are ready, I believe it is time to show Thalvane exactly what Earth is capable of. Elena took a slow breath, feeling the weight of every soldier who had died in the 6 long years of this war, resting on the decision she was about to make, and gave the order that would decide the fate of humanity. In the days leading up to the battle, Elena had traveled personally to as many of the assembled ships as time allowed, speaking with crews who understood exactly what was being asked of them. Aboard the cruiser Endeavour, she stood before a hangar bay full of tired, frightened young sailors, many of whom had joined the Navy only in the last 2 years, drawn into a war that showed no sign of ending. I will not pretend this is anything other than dangerous, Elena told them, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was asking. Some of us will not survive what comes next, but I have seen, with my own eyes, what this ship beside us is capable of, and I have seen what happens when human courage is given even a small advantage to work with. We have spent 6 years being pushed backward. Today, we push back. The response from that hangar bay, hundreds of voices rising together in something between a cheer and a promise, stayed with Elena as she returned to the Hyperion to prepare for the battle ahead. She thought of it again now, standing on the bridge, watching Thalvane's overwhelming fleet fill her sensor display, and she drew strength from the memory of those tired, determined faces. Young people, willing to risk everything for a chance at a future they had never truly been allowed to hope for. All ships, she said, her voice carrying clearly across every open channel in the assembled human fleet. Execute the plan. For Earth. Earth was losing the Galactic War. Then a forgotten human warship returned. Meridian's Rest had once been a quiet, unremarkable system, home to nothing more interesting than a scattered asteroid field and a large gas giant with a handful of frozen moons, none of them ever settled by any species that had passed through this part of space. Elena's staff had chosen it carefully over the course of several weeks, studying its gravitational features and terrain, the way a general studies a battlefield, searching for every possible advantage that might help offset the Skarn fleet's overwhelming numerical superiority. The dense asteroid field along the system's inner edge would make large-scale formation flying difficult for the Skarn fleet, forcing them to either slow their advance considerably or break into smaller groups vulnerable to the exact kind of isolated engagements the Hyperion excelled at creating. The gas giant's massive gravitational pull, meanwhile, offered a place to hide Elena's reserve fleet entirely from sensor detection until the precise moment she needed them, a detail she had shared with only a handful of her most trusted officers, unwilling to risk that final surprise leaking out before the battle even began. The Battle of Meridian's Rest began with silence, and then it began with fire. Thalvane's fleet advanced in its customary formation, 200 warships arranged in overlapping defensive layers designed to crush any opposing force through sheer coordinated firepower. He expected the human fleet gathered ahead of him, roughly 90 ships by his sensor count, to fight bravely and lose, exactly as every previous human fleet had done for 6 years of war. He did not expect Elena Voss's actual plan. Rather than meeting the Skarn fleet head-on, the human formation split apart the moment battle was joined, smaller groups of newly shielded ships peeling away toward the edges of the system, using the gravitational features of Meridian's Rest, a dense asteroid field and the pull of a nearby gas giant, to break up the Skarn fleet's tight formation and force individual engagements rather than one overwhelming mass battle. "They are scattering," Thalvane observed, watching his tactical display with narrowed eyes. "Order our escort groups to pursue and destroy the fleeing elements." It was, Elena had gambled, exactly the response Thalvane's disciplined but rigid doctrine would produce, and it was exactly what she needed him to do. As Skarn escort groups broke formation to chase down the scattering human ships, the Hyperion, running silent under Arya's improved stealth field, positioned itself precisely where Elena's staff had calculated the gap in Skarn coverage would open, directly behind Thalvane's own flagship group, protected by only a fraction of its original escort strength. "Now," Elena said quietly. The Hyperion's stealth field dropped, and every weapon system aboard the ancient warship opened fire simultaneously on the Devourer's Pride and its remaining escorts. The effect was devastating. 2 escort cruisers went dark in the first 3 seconds of fire, their shields overwhelmed by weapons technology that Skarn defensive systems simply were not designed to counter. The Devourer's Pride itself shuddered under a direct hit that tore through its outer shielding and scarred its hull deeply, alarms blaring across its bridge as Thalvane stared in disbelief at a tactical display that made no sense to him. "Impossible," he said. "That vessel was supposed to be operating on the flank, harassing our reserve elements. How is it here?" "Sir, our scouts report the flank engagement is a decoy fleet. Human ships modified to mimic the Hyperion's energy signature," his sensor officer reported, panic creeping into his voice for the first time in the engagement. "The real vessel bypassed our formation entirely." Thalvane had been outmaneuvered, and he knew it immediately, for exactly what it was. Elena's plan had relied on a carefully constructed deception, several human ships fitted with equipment designed to mimic the Hyperion's unique power signature, just enough to draw Skarn attention and resources toward false threats, while the real Hyperion, slipped through the gap created by his own fleet's aggressive pursuit of the scattering human formation. "All ships, regroup on my position immediately," Thalvane ordered, but the command came too late. His fleet, spread thin across the system chasing scattered human decoys, could not reform quickly enough to save his flagship group from the concentrated fury of the Hyperion's weapons. Elsewhere across the battle, the newly upgraded human ships, equipped with shielding based on Vareth technology principles Arya had shared with Earth's engineers, were performing far better than the Skarn fleet had anticipated. Individual engagements that would have been one-sided slaughters just months earlier were now closely fought battles, human vessels surviving hits that would have destroyed them outright before the upgrades, buying crucial time and inflicting losses the Skarn commanders had not planned for. "Admiral, the decoy elements report they're taking heavy losses but holding," Hoyt reported from his station aboard the Hyperion, his voice tight with the strain of tracking a battle unfolding across an entire star system. "Fleet Command estimates we've destroyed or crippled 40% of Thalvane's committed escort forces." "And the Devourer's Pride?" Elena asked, watching the massive Skarn flagship on her display, still fighting despite the damage the Hyperion had already inflicted. "Still active, still fighting," Arya reported. "Their commander is skilled, Admiral. He is adapting his defensive formation even now, attempting to concentrate his remaining nearby ships, to overwhelm us, through combined fire, rather than allowing further isolated engagements." Elena watched as 3 Skarn cruisers began converging on the Hyperion's position, their combined weapons fire finally beginning to find their mark, as the element of surprise faded, and Thalvane's tactical genius reasserted itself, even in the chaos of a battle going badly for him. "Shields at 60%, Arya reported. "Structural integrity holding, but this concentration of fire is more effective than our previous engagements. Recommend evasive maneuvering." "Do it," Elena said, "but keep us in weapons range of that flagship. If we can take out the Devourer's Pride, this entire engagement changes." Captain Coral, watching the battle unfold from his advisory station, with the calm of a man who had faced impossible odds for 31 years and survived them, leaned toward Elena. "Thalvane will not run," Coral said quietly. "Whatever else he is, every report Arya has compiled on this commander suggests he does not abandon his people. He will stay and fight, even against unfavorable odds, rather than leave his fleet leaderless in the middle of this battle." "Then we make him pay for that loyalty," Elena said grimly. Aboard the cruiser Endeavor, the same ship whose crew Elena had addressed personally, days before the battle, young sailors fought with a desperation and determination that surprised even their own commanding officers. A junior gunnery officer named Mikhail Torres, barely 20 years old, and only 6 months into his first deployment, found himself managing an entire weapons deck alone after his superior officer was wounded in the opening minutes of the engagement. He did not have time to be afraid. He simply did what needed doing, coordinating fire against a Skarn cruiser twice the size of his own ship, drawing on training he had barely finished completing before the battle began. "Direct hit," Torres called out, watching the enemy cruiser's shields flare, and finally collapse under the concentrated fire of the Endeavor's upgraded weapons systems. "Their shields are down, finishing shot ready." The Endeavor's captain, an older woman named Bethany Cole, who had survived 4 previous major engagements of the war, gave the order without hesitation, and the Skarn cruiser went dark moments later, one small victory among hundreds unfolding simultaneously across the vast battlefield of Meridian's Rest. Moments like these repeated themselves across dozens of individual engagements throughout the system, young and inexperienced crews finding reserves of skill and courage they had not known they possessed, buoyed by shielding technology that gave them a fighting chance where none had existed before, and by the simple, powerful knowledge that for the first time in 6 years, they were not fighting a battle already lost before it began. The battle raged for nearly 4 hours, longer than almost any engagement of the war, as the initial advantage of surprise gave way to a grinding, desperate fight across the entirety of the Meridian's Rest system. Ships on both sides burned and died among the asteroid fields and the shadow of the gas giant, human pilots and Skarn warriors alike, fighting with a desperation that came only when both sides understood exactly what was at stake. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. The Hyperion, despite taking damage that would have destroyed any other human vessel several times over, continued fighting, its shields regenerating between engagements, using power reserves and technology that no Skarn officer had ever encountered before. The newly upgraded human fleet, though suffering losses, held their positions far better than anyone on the Skarn side had anticipated, buying time for reinforcements that Elena had quietly held in reserve, hidden behind the gas giant's mass, to finally arrive at the critical moment. When those reserve ships, 40 additional vessels that Elena had kept hidden throughout the engagement specifically for this purpose, emerged to strike at the flank of Thalvain's remaining forces, the battle's outcome became clear to everyone watching, human and Skarn alike. Aboard the Devourer's Pride, Thalvain watched the battle unravel around him with the cold, clear focus of a commander who had spent 30 cycles learning to separate emotion from tactical judgment, even as that judgment delivered conclusions he did not want to accept. His sensor officer reported losses climbing past 60 warships destroyed or disabled, with dozens more scattered and unable to reform in any meaningful formation, before the human reserve fleet, emerging from behind the gas giant, struck directly at his remaining escort strength. "Sir," Commander Ketressa said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, "if we do not withdraw now, we risk losing the entire fleet. There will be nothing left to defend our supply lines, let alone continue the advance." Thalvain said nothing for a long moment, staring at the tactical display that confirmed everything his own instincts had already told him. 30 cycles of victories, undone in a single afternoon by an enemy his own doctrine had taught him to consider beneath serious concern. It was, he understood with a strange, distant clarity, precisely the kind of overconfidence he had always warned his own subordinates against, and he had fallen into it anyway, certain that no lesser species could ever truly threaten a properly prepared Skarn fleet. Thalvain, watching his fleet's losses mount past the point of any reasonable recovery, made the only decision his own doctrine would allow him to make honorably. He ordered what remained of his forces to withdraw, covering their retreat personally with the Devourer's Pride, buying time with his own flagship for as many of his surviving ships to escape as possible. The Hyperion had one clear shot at the fleeing Devourer's Pride as it covered its fleet's retreat, weapons charged and locked, a shot that Arya calculated would almost certainly destroy the Skarn flagship and its commander entirely. "Fire," Elena started to say, and then stopped herself. She watched Thalvain's flagship on her display, damaged and alone, covering the retreat of ships that no longer had any tactical advantage over Earth's forces, and something in her, some memory of every human life lost in 6 years of war, told her that destroying this one ship would not end anything that truly mattered. "Hold fire," Elena said instead. "Let them go." Coral looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Are you certain, Admiral?" "We won this battle," Elena said quietly. "We didn't win it by matching their cruelty. Let Thalvain carry word back to his hegemony of what happened here today. Let them know Earth is not the easy prey they believed us to be. That matters more than one more kill." The Skarn fleet withdrew from Meridian's Rest that day, having lost over half their committed force, their advance toward Earth's home system shattered for the first time in 6 years of steady, grinding losses. It was not the end of the war. Elena knew that better than anyone, and so did Coral, and so did every officer aboard the fleet that had fought and bled and somehow held that day. The Skarn hegemony was still vast, still powerful, still committed to a war they had started believing Earth could never truly resist. But something fundamental had changed at Meridian's Rest, something that spread through every human colony and outpost within days, as news of the victory traveled across the war zone. For 6 years, Earth had been losing this war, retreating, bleeding, watching its worlds fall one by one, to an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Now, for the first time, humanity had won a battle that mattered, a battle that had actually stopped the enemy's advance rather than merely slowing it. Back aboard the Hyperion, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, Elena stood beside Captain Coral on the ship's observation deck, looking out at the drifting wreckage of the battle they had just survived. 31 years, Coral said softly. "I spent 31 years wondering if I would ever see Earth again, wondering if any of it would matter when I finally did. I did not expect to come home and find a war waiting for me. But I am glad, in the end, that I did."
"You saved us, Captain," Elena said. "Whatever else happens in this war, Earth owes you and every soul who served aboard this ship a debt we can never fully repay."
"We are not finished yet," Coral said, looking out at the stars with the quiet determination of a man who had faced impossible odds before and refused to be broken by them. "The hegemony will regroup. They will come again, eventually, with greater numbers and better preparations. But we have proven something today, Admiral. Something this crew and I spent 31 years hoping we would live to see." "What's that?" Elena asked. "That Earth is not finished," Coral said. "Not while there are still people willing to fight for her. Not while there is still hope left to carry forward." Far above them, unseen by any sensor aboard the Hyperion or any ship in the human fleet, a small dark shape continued its long, silent journey through the void, carrying its recorded data toward a distant destination, toward a power that had watched humanity's desperate fight from the shadows and had finally seen enough to make its own decision about what would come next. In the weeks that followed the battle, Earth Command worked quickly to make the most of the victory at Meridian's Rest. Upgraded shielding technology, already rolling out slowly before the battle, now became the Council's highest priority. Entire shipyards on Mars and Titan retooled to incorporate everything Arya had shared about Verith engineering principles. Recruitment offices across the remaining human colonies reported a surge of new volunteers in the days after news of the victory spread. Young people who had grown up believing the war was already lost, now willing to fight for a future that suddenly seemed possible again. Captain Coral, at Elena's insistence, remained aboard the Hyperion as her senior advisor, though he firmly declined every offer of a formal command position, insisting his fighting days belonged to a chapter of his life that had already closed. He spent his time instead working alongside Arya and Earth's engineering corps, translating 31 years of hard-won knowledge into something the rest of humanity could actually use, patient in a way that only someone who had survived so much loss could truly be. Elena Voss returned briefly to Earth itself in the aftermath of the battle, standing for the first time in years on solid ground beneath an open sky, rather than the recycled air of a starship far from home. She thought, as she looked up at the stars that had cost so much and given back so little for 6 long years, of every soldier who had not lived to see this small, hard-won turn in their fortunes. She thought of her brother, lost at Ceres Reach. She thought of every name recorded in the growing memorial lists that Earth Command maintained, a grim, ever-lengthening record of a war that had taken so much from so many. The war was not over. Elena understood that with the same clear-eyed realism that had carried her through 6 years of losses. The Skarn hegemony was vast, and Thalvane's defeat, however significant, was only a single battle in a conflict that had already claimed far too much. But for the first time since the fighting began, Earth's people looked up at those same stars and saw something other than an enemy's approach. They saw, instead, the faint possibility of a future worth continuing to fight for. And somewhere out in the vast darkness between the stars, far beyond the reach of any human sensor array, old allies and old enemies alike were beginning to take notice of the forgotten warship that had returned to change everything, watching carefully to see what humanity would do next, now that it had finally remembered how to hope.